Hi, folks. Welcome to Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. from the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. Apologies once again for my ugly black eye. Yes, I am a klutz. In this podcast, I will address the subject of why the third world and why not the first world. In other words, why should we place our hope initially at least, that the third world will be the place where revolution will start and perhaps end, I don't know, and not the first world. Certainly, Marx and Engels believed that revolution would begin in the first world. They said so. They predicted that revolution would begin in Europe at the end of the 19th century. They were wrong. They were human beings. Like all human beings, they make mistakes. They certainly made a big one on that. And there was no revolution. There were no revolutions at the end of the 19th century. So they were wrong about that. There were certainly revolutions throughout the 20th century. And those revolutions, in many cases, were successful. There have been some revolutions in the 21st century, but all of those revolutions have been in the third world. All of them. None in the first world. That is why the first world, not the third world. As I previously said, I am not passing the buck at all. I'm not saying, well, I give up, or I guess we give up. We've tried, we failed. Okay, that's it. No more effort, no more attempts at revolutionary activity. There is no chance of doing anything here. So let's just simply throw our hands up in the air like that and turn the burden over to the third world. No, I mean, that would be silly. That would also be arrogant. That would be imperialistic. I certainly, as a first worlder, have no right to tell the third world what to do. For decades, for over a century, that is precisely what the first world has been doing, trying to tell the third world what to do, and often very successfully. The third world has been controlled and manipulated by the third world. The reason for calling for revolution in the third world is not passing the buck. It's not imperialism or colonialism. It is literally giving those up and instead trying to empower people in the third world, renouncing the power of the first world, recognizing that true power, at least for now, lies not in the first world, but in the third world. That is the entire point, basically, of Maoism third worldism, as I understand it. It has nothing to do with defeatism. I am not a defeatist at all. Anyone who knows me will tell you that. I'm a person with very strong convictions. I fight for what I believe in. I am always willing to struggle. And I have no problem fighting for communism in the United States if I thought that was a realistic possibility right now, but I don't. I don't. Now, are there dialectical contradictions in the first world? Of course. There are dialectical contradictions everywhere. That's what capitalism does. Capitalism in the 21st century, sometimes called late stage capitalism, is itself a contradiction. And as a contradiction, it consists of still other contradictions. So there is no attempt at trying to simply give up, pass the buck, try defeatism, anything like that. Nothing like that at all. That has nothing to do with Maoism, third worldism. Many of our enemies, first worldists, some first worldists, see it that way. Now, are all first worldists our enemies? No. I just watched a YouTube video which was made by first worldists, which had a very friendly attitude toward third worldists and argued that third worldists made some very valid points. But the producers of the video still felt that there was a possibility of revolution in the first world. I will link to that video immediately below this podcast on YouTube so you can watch it for yourself. It's an interesting video. Do I agree with the premise? No, because the premise is that we can still have revolution right now in the first world, which I don't think is possible. And I base that on simple observation as a sociologist. In the 21st century and in the late 20th century, the only places where revolutionary activity have taken place have been in the third world. In Iraq, where basically that activity was anarchist. In Mexico, and in other places. So when I look at the first world, what I see are a bunch of people who seem to be content sitting on their butts. We are spoiled. We are overfed. We have too many conveniences, literally. We are not really suffering that much. Now, are there individuals who are suffering? Surely. I know some. I know some. But not compared to the third world. The reason, as I've said before, why I moved down here to Hidalgo County in Texas, where I am literally 2 miles north of Mexico, the warmest climate in Texas. I am on the same latitude as Miami, Florida. Again, the reason I moved here is to be close to the third world. It is not realistic for me to move to the third world. I am a retired person. And I suppose that I might be able to, if I really understood finance better than I do, which I don't, to figure out some way to twist things around and move down to some part of Mexico, maybe. But if so, I don't know what that is. Plus, I am an autistic. And as an autistic, I have a great deal of difficulty with change. Now, my difficulty with change is certainly not as great as it once was. I am much better than I used to be. I can now adapt to change much more rapidly, much more effectively than I could even a decade ago. But still, picking up all of my belongings, or even leaving all my belongings behind, which might even be worse, and moving to Mexico or some other third world country, I literally don't think I could do that. So it's not a question for me of giving up. It's a question of introspection, or what sociologist Charles Horton Cooley referred to as sympathetic introspection. I examine my life. I consider my limitations, and I am more aware of anyone else than anyone else of my limitations. I know what I can do, and I know what I can't do, or at least what I think I can't do. Now, could I move? I don't think so. I'm being honest. I literally don't think so. If I thought I could move to Mexico, I would. I also don't know Spanish. I would have to learn Spanish. That may or may not be a chore, I don't know. But I don't know it. It would be hard for me to live in Mexico. I would have to hire a translator, at least initially. So I look again at the first world, particularly the United States, the heart of the empire, the center of global imperialism. How in the world could there be a revolution now, right here? I don't see it. Most Americans I know support the empire. They don't want to destroy the empire. They want to make the empire nicer or fairer for those living inside of it, right? Bernie Sanders, for instance, AOC, for instance. They don't talk about the third world, or if they do, I haven't heard it. They are first worlders. And that is the world they care about, primarily, as best I can tell. I can't get inside their heads. I can only listen to their words. And so, as a first worlder myself, as somebody living in the first world, and by the way, I'm making a distinction between first worlder and first worldist. I'm a first worlder because I live here, but I am not a first worldist because I don't believe that communism can start here. That's why, although I am not a third worlder, I don't live in the third world, I am a third worldist, which means I believe that revolution possibly can begin in the third world. But again, as I have said so many times before, there are no guarantees. We could literally end up destroying ourselves. Every day, I follow the news very, very closely. I always have. Going back to the Kennedy assassination, which I remember vividly. I'm an old guy. I remember exactly where I was sitting in the classroom when the principal came over the PA system and announced that President Jack Kennedy had been shot. We all called him Jack. Nobody called him President Kennedy or John F. Kennedy. People called him Jack and his wife Jackie, Jack and Jackie. I remember when the principal announced that, my teacher, Mrs. Hoplamazian, her head literally dropped down onto her desk and she started sobbing uncontrollably. We were kids. I remember I did not know what to do. My memory is not quite photographic, but pretty close. As I have said on many occasions to my friends, that is both a blessing and a curse. In terms of remembering good things, it is a blessing. In terms of remembering bad things, it is a curse. So I remember the assassination of Kennedy. I remember when Jack was shot. I remember when the principal came back on the PA system a few minutes later and announced that Jack Kennedy was now dead and that classes had been called off for the day. Well, as it turned out, they were not only called off for the day, they were called off for the entire week. I went home and my mother was uncontrollably sobbing as well. As an autistic, I did not feel any emotion. I could not feel any emotion other than shock. Sorrow, sadness, empathy, no. So I asked my mother, why are you crying? Because I could not understand it. I could not relate to it. As I recall, she yelled at me something like, shut up, which I can understand in retrospect. I might have said the same thing if I were in her situation. So now I remember the events that have taken place throughout my more recent lifetime, like 9/11. I recall exactly where I was sitting on my bed watching television. I actually saw live the second plane crash into the World Trade Center. Now, I am a native New Yorker. I lived close enough to Manhattan. I was in Queens, first the Bronx, then Queens, but I was in Queens at that time. And every day I would look at that building and see it get higher and higher and higher. It was an ugly building. No one I knew liked it. But after 9/11, everyone suddenly loved it. It was a much different story. At the time, I hoped, as a communist, that Americans would look at what happened on 9/11, not only at the World Trade Center, but also at the Pentagon, and begin a process of self-reflection and realize why it is that Al-Qaeda had attacked the Pentagon, and the World Trade Center, and was possibly planning a third attack on either the Capitol or the White House. That third plane, because of the brave passengers on board, crashed into Pennsylvania, so we will never know for sure exactly where that plane was headed. But I knew what had happened. Immediately, the World Trade Center, the center of global commerce, the Pentagon, the center of the most powerful military in the world, together making up what President Dwight Eisenhower, Ike, called the military-industrial complex. That's what bin Laden and al-Qaeda were attacking. Does that justify what they did? No, of course not. You don't blow up buildings and kill people like that. That was a right-wing fascist attack. Bin Laden was not a communist. He was trying to establish Islamism, not communism. Islamism meaning an Islamic theocracy. That was their objective, and that remains the objective of al-Qaeda and ISIS and other similar organizations like Hamas. So I have no sympathy for those organizations. But I understood why they did what they did. I understood why they attacked those buildings. It was the third world lashing out at the center of the first world, the United States of America. At that moment, I had hope. It turned out to be false hope. But I had hope. I said, in the midst of my grieving, along with everyone else, since I remember people jumping out of the World Trade Center to their deaths. I saw that live on television. Because of my near photographic memory, not quite photographic, but close, I still visualize it. That is the curse of having a nearly photographic memory. So I hoped, naively, I guess, that Americans would wake up and would see what we had become, the center of global corruption. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened? A member of Congress protested and demanded that French fries be changed in name to freedom fries. Why? Because France dared to challenge American intelligence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. That was soon after 9/11. So we went to war against Afghanistan. Then we went to war against Iraq. For what? To advance the interests of empire. That is it. So, living in the belly of the beast, living in the heart of empire, right here in the US, how in the world could I possibly imagine that with all of the Americans who support imperialism, not all, certainly, there are exceptions, like me and others, of course, I'm not alone, but we are a tiny, tiny minority. How can revolution begin here? I don't see it. So, at that point, I briefly left First Worldism and became a Maoist Third Worldist. Shortly after 9/11 and the beginning of the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war. But then somehow I lost my focus. I guess I didn't forget, but I developed a sense of false hope that maybe the first world could rise up and abolish the capitalist world system. How wrong could a person be? So, in June of this year, 2023, I returned to Maoism, Third Worldism, recognizing once again, and for the final time, that the third world, not the first world, must be the genesis of revolution. Whether the first world eventually joins the third world, maybe. If there is still a first world, maybe it will join it, maybe. If the United States, if Western Europe, if Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and so on are still around, then perhaps they will follow the third world. What a switch. The first world following the third world. Topsy-turvy. All this time, it's been the third world following the first world by force, under threat. But the first world, I think, will be defeated, and I don't think that defeat is too far off. What not too far off means, I have no idea. I am not a prophet. I am not even a very good prognosticator. So I have no idea. But I do see revolution beginning there. And I am not passing the buck once again. I am recognizing the power that the third world has because it is oppressed. It is the victim of the first world. And as it fights for emancipation from the first world, from capitalism, through a revolutionary process or event, that communism may be established in the third world. And I hope eventually in the first world as well. But to be honest with you, am I optimistic? No. I will never throw away hope. Never. But just as I had that optimism after 9/11, which turned out to be entirely ill-founded, I learned from my mistake. So I will not make that mistake of carrying that sense of false optimism again. Hope? Yeah, okay, hope, maybe. Although hope is a bit too utopian for me, idealistic in the sense of ontological idealism, that the mind is the essence of the universe, which I don't believe. But maybe. But I think we all need to work together in the first world through conscientization, critical consciousness, and conscience raising of the third world. As I hope that this podcast will be seen by many people, hopefully, at some point in the third world. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.